worst night of my life started like any other shift. I was 17, working at a local convenience store in a small town in the US. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid just enough to help my family. We'd been struggling ever since my mom got sick a few years back. Medical bills piled up, and vacations or even buying something as simple as new clothes became luxuries we couldn't afford. So, here I was, spending my summer working night shifts instead of hanging out like a normal teenager. The store was a strange little place, a mix of deli, gas station, and convenience store. The kind of spot you'd only find in a town as small as mine. I worked the register most of the time. People came in, bought gas or snacks, and left. It wasn't exciting, but it was easy. Honestly, I didn't mind it much. It gave me time to think about my future, especially since I'd managed to get some solid scholarship offers for college. My parents were proud, and I was determined to make it out of our financial mess. But working nights wasn't exactly ideal. It got quiet. Too quiet. When there weren't customers, the silence would creep in, and my mind would wander. That's when I'd start to notice things I normally wouldn't. A flickering light here, a weird noise there. I always told myself it was just my imagination. Nothing bad ever happened in our town. At least, that's what I thought. Then there was Derek. He was in his mid-20s, tall, and had this way of staring at you that made your skin crawl. I didn't know much about him except that he'd been working there longer than me. Derek wasn't outright mean, but he had this habit of saying things that left you uncomfortable, comments that were just off. He'd laugh about dark stuff like how easy it'd be to rob the place or how people in small towns could disappear without a trace. I tried to avoid him when I could, but on this particular night I had no choice. My manager asked me to cover a double shift, which meant working until midnight. I agreed because honestly, I needed the money, and it wasn't like I had plans. Derek was on the schedule too, and I already knew it was going to be a long night. When I clocked in, he greeted me with his usual smirk. "Looks like it's just us tonight," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I forced a smile and nodded, already dreading the hours ahead. The first half of the night was slow, like always. A few customers trickled in and out, but by 10 p.m. it was dead quiet. That's when Derek started acting weird. He kept pacing around the store, muttering to himself. At one point he asked, "You ever think about how fragile life is?" I didn't respond. Instead, I busied myself with stocking shelves, hoping he'd leave me alone. But the uneasy feeling in my gut only got worse. Something about Derek felt off that night, more than usual. I should have trusted my instincts. Looking back, I wish I'd walked out then and there. By 10:30 p.m., I was already counting the minutes until the shift was over. The quiet hum of the refrigerators and the soft buzzing of the fluorescent lights were my only company. Derek had disappeared to the back of the store for a while, which was fine by me. The less interaction I had with him, the better. Just as I started to relax, Derek walked back to the front, holding a can of some off-brand energy drink. "You look tired," he said, tossing it onto the counter in front of me. "Here, on the house." I hesitated. I wasn't a huge fan of energy drinks, but I had been yawning nonstop. "Thanks," I muttered, cracking it open and taking a sip. It tasted awful, but I didn't want to seem rude. About 15 minutes later, my manager called. He asked me to stay even later, until 2 a.m. Apparently, the guy who was supposed to relieve me had car trouble. I almost said no, but I knew my family could use the extra money. Besides, how bad could a few extra hours be? Derek must have overheard the conversation because he smirked. "Guess it's just you and me for a while longer," he said. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach and focused on cleaning up around the register. Around 11 p.m., things started to blur. My hands felt heavy, and my head started to spin. At first, I thought I was just overtired, but then it hit me. Something wasn't right. I stumbled back toward the storage room, thinking maybe I just needed some air. The next thing I knew, the room tilted, and I hit the floor hard. My vision went dark, and everything around me faded into nothing. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, the store was eerily silent. My head was pounding, and my mouth felt dry, like I'd been chewing on cotton. For a moment, I couldn't even remember where I was. Then I noticed it, the faint smell of something metallic in the air. I pushed myself up, my legs shaky, and tried to focus. That's when I heard it, a soft crunching sound under my shoes. I looked down and froze. The floor was littered with something, tiny shards of white and red. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't candy or glass. It was pieces of bone, splattered with blood. I staggered back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the dark streaks leading from the front of the store to the corner near the refrigerators. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. Something terrible had happened while I was out, and I had no idea what or who was responsible. I forced myself to move, every step feeling like I was wading through quicksand. The blood trail led me toward the refrigerators, where the faint hum of the coolers seemed deafening in the silence. My hands were trembling as I reached the corner, and that's when I saw him. Derek's body was slumped against the wall, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled around him, thick and dark, spreading across the floor. His face, or what was left of it, was barely recognizable. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I couldn't look away. In his lap was a handgun, and next to him his phone was propped up on a small tripod, the screen still glowing. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, trying to process what I was seeing. I glanced at the phone, and curiosity, morbid and uncontrollable, got the better of me. The video was still recording. My fingers hesitated before pressing play, and as the footage began, my blood turned to ice. The video showed me slumped over the counter, unconscious. Derek was pacing back and forth, talking to the camera. His voice was eerily calm, almost cheerful. "This is it," he said, "the moment everyone will remember me for." He held up a small vial, smirking. "Just a little something to help her sleep through the show," he said, waving it toward my drink on the counter. My stomach dropped. He had drugged me. The video continued, showing Derek setting up the tripod and positioning himself in front of the camera. He rambled on about fame, how the world never noticed him, and how this would change everything. "I'm not a violent person," he said, his voice oddly soft. "But sometimes you have to do something extreme to leave a mark." Then he looked directly into the camera, his smile fading. "Emily's lucky. She gets to live. She'll be the one to tell the world who I was and what I did. She'll carry my story." The video cut to him picking up the gun, his hand shaking slightly. He sat down against the wall, staring straight into the camera. "This is for you," he whispered, before pulling the trigger. The screen went black. I threw the phone across the floor, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. Derek hadn't just planned to end his own life. He'd wanted to make me a part of his twisted narrative. I stumbled back toward the register, my legs barely holding me up. My hand reached for the phone in my pocket, and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. When the operator answered, all I could manage to say was, "There's been an incident. Please send help." I collapsed into the chair behind the counter, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I waited for the police to arrive. The police arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes. Their flashing lights painted the store in pulses of red and blue, adding to the surreal nightmare. Two officers entered cautiously, their hands on their holsters. I barely managed to point toward the back, where Derek's body was. One of them gently guided me outside while the other stayed behind to secure the scene. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and unforgiving. I sat on the curb, my knees pulled to my chest, staring at nothing. They asked me questions, but I don't remember what I said. My mind was stuck on the video, the sound of Derek's voice and the crunch of bone under my shoes. I heard snippets of the officers' conversations, words like evidence, mental instability, and suicide. They found the vial in the trash and confirmed it was laced with sedatives. I was allowed to go home once they were done. My parents were waiting for me, their faces pale with worry. I broke down the moment I saw them, sobbing into my mom's arms. The summer felt endless after that night. I couldn't go back to the store. Even driving past it made my stomach churn. My parents, despite our financial struggles, managed to scrape together enough money to get me into therapy. It helped a little, but some days I still felt trapped in that moment. The journalists didn't help either. Word got out about what happened, and reporters started calling, trying to get my side of the story. I refused to talk to any of them. I didn't want to be the girl from the convenience store incident. Now I'm just trying to figure out what's next. College is still on the horizon, and I'm holding on to the hope that I can leave this behind. But no matter how far I go, a part of me knows I'll always carry that night with me. Derek got his wish, I'll never forget him. But I refuse to let him define me. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that night. Honestly, most of my shifts at JCPenney were boring as hell. I had just graduated high school, still living at home with my parents and little brother in a quiet town in middle of nowhere America. The kind of town where the mall is the only place to hang out, and even that feels like a last resort. The store was only about 10 minutes from my house, so working part-time there made sense. It was nothing special. Fold clothes, check people out at the register, go home. My shifts were mostly in the evening, which I liked because the place would slow down after 8 p.m. and I could zone out for the last hour. That night started the same way. It was a Wednesday, and my shift was 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. By 8:15, the store was dead. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and some generic mall music played in the background. I stood at the register, half watching the entrance, half counting down the minutes until closing. Then the automatic doors slid open. A woman walked in, blonde hair cut just above her shoulders, oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes. Sunglasses. At night. Indoors. Weird, but I figured maybe she was trying to look cool or something. She didn't wander around like most customers. She came straight toward me. "Hi," she said, her voice low and calm. "Hi," I replied, trying not to look as bored as I felt. "I need to return something," she said, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. "Oh sure, returns are over there at customer service," I said, pointing to the far end of the store. But she didn't move. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of fabric. She laid it on the counter between us, smoothing it out carefully. "I want to return this," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. I glanced down, expecting something generic like a sweater or a pair of jeans. But what I saw made my stomach twist. It was my volleyball warm-up jersey. I stared at it, frozen. My name and number were printed clearly on the back, just like the one I had worn throughout junior year. I didn't know what to say. For a long moment, I just stared at the jersey, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't just similar. It was mine. "I'm sorry," I finally said, my voice shaking. "This is mine." "How did you get this?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, expressionless behind those sunglasses. "Seriously," I pressed, my voice rising. "Where did you get this?" Without a word, she turned and started walking away. "Wait, hey," I called after her, but she didn't stop. She walked out of the store, the automatic doors hissing shut behind her. I ran around the counter, clutching the jersey, and followed her outside. But when I got to the parking lot, she was gone. Just gone. No car pulling away, no footsteps echoing into the night. Back inside, I stuffed the jersey into my bag and spent the rest of my shift in a fog. When I got home, the first thing I did was check my closet. My heart pounded as I dug through every corner, but it wasn't there. The jersey, the one I swore I hadn't lost, was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, her pale face emotionless behind those glasses. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off, but the nightmares came quickly. In them, I was back at the store, but it wasn't the same. The aisles were darker, endless, and the shelves were filled with things that belonged to me. Old shoes, childhood toys, even the necklace my mom gave me when I turned 16. And then, At the end of the aisle, she was there, watching me, holding the jersey. "Come find me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a wind through the store. When I woke up, my room felt wrong, like something had shifted. The air was heavy and there was a faint, sickly sweet smell lingering, like cheap floral perfume. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. Every time the automatic doors opened, I tensed up, half expecting to see her again. I couldn't stop thinking about the jersey or the dream. I decided to ask around. Maybe someone else had seen her. "Hey, Pete," I said to the security guard near the entrance. "Did you see a blonde woman last night? Sunglasses? Kinda weird?" He frowned, shaking his head. "Blonde woman? Nah, didn't see anyone like that." "Why?" "No reason," I mumbled, feeling silly for even asking. But when I mentioned it to Lisa, my co-worker, she got this strange look on her face. "Wait, was she, creepy? Like sunglasses and weird energy?" "Yeah," I said, my stomach tightening. "Why?" Lisa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There's this story about a lady like that. Some of the older staff used to talk about her. They say she's been coming here for years, always at night, always returning something that doesn't belong here." "What?" I asked, goosebumps prickling my skin. "No one knows who she is. Some people think she's a thief or a prankster, but..." Lisa hesitated. "I don't know. It's just weird." That night, I stayed late to help clean up, and when the store finally emptied, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the aisles. When I turned, she was there, standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me. I don't know what came over me. Fear, maybe, or anger. But I couldn't let her leave this time. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked toward the stockroom. I hesitated for a moment, but then I followed. The door to the stockroom was open, something that should never happen after hours. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room was freezing and the faint hum of the lights buzzed overhead. In the middle of the floor was a small pile of things. My old volleyball knee pads, a pair of sneakers I'd lost years ago, even the bracelet I'd thought was gone forever. And on top was the jersey. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, stepping closer. The lights flickered, and I heard her laugh. A soft, chilling sound that made my blood run cold. "You know why," she said, her voice echoing. When I turned, she was inches from me, her sunglasses gone. Her eyes were black pits, endless and empty. "You can't take back what's already mine," she whispered. The lights went out completely. I screamed, stumbling backward, and when I finally found the door, I burst through it into the brightly lit store. When I looked back, the room was empty. I quit the next day. But every so often I find things missing, things I know I didn't lose. And sometimes, late at night, I smell that cheap floral perfume. I used to work at a sporting goods store in a small town. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like home. Sports had always been a big part of my life, and being surrounded by gear was oddly comforting. Most nights were slow, with only a handful of customers wandering in. It gave me plenty of time to zone out while stocking shelves or cleaning up. This night was no different, or so I thought. The store was eerily quiet, with just a few people browsing, and my co-workers were up at the front goofing around. I was working alone in the aisle near the baseball section, organizing gloves and bats. Then I heard it. A soft thunk, followed by the unmistakable sound of something rolling across the floor. I turned, and there it was, a baseball, lazily rolling into my aisle. It didn't make sense. The ball section was 3 aisles over. Maybe it had fallen from a shelf. I picked it up, feeling the smooth leather in my hands, and placed it back on a shelf nearby. That's when another baseball flew into the aisle. This one wasn't rolling, it was launched. It whizzed past me and smacked into a shelf, sending a couple of gloves tumbling to the floor. "Hey, who's throwing that?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. The aisle was empty. My heart rate spiked as I walked to the end, peeking around the corner. Nothing. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably a prank. Maybe one of my coworkers was trying to mess with me. But as I returned to the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Barely a minute had passed when another baseball came hurtling toward me. This time it grazed my shoulder before slamming into the shelf behind me. That was it. "All right, who's messing with me?" I shouted, stepping out of the aisle. The store was quiet, too quiet. I scanned the aisles, but saw no one. Then I caught movement near the far end of the store. A man stood by the baseball section, his back turned to me. He wore a dark hoodie, and I noticed his shoulders shake like he was laughing. "Hey!" I yelled, marching toward him. As soon as I moved, he darted around the corner. I followed, but when I turned the corner, he was gone. Frustrated, I walked back to the main floor and told my coworkers. Mike, my shift lead, smirked. "Sounds like you're imagining things, man. Maybe you need a break." "I'm serious," I snapped. "There's some guy messing around. Keep an eye out, all right?" Mike shrugged but nodded, and I went back to work. That's when I saw him again. This time, he wasn't alone. As I rounded the corner of the baseball section, I froze. The man was there, but he wasn't alone. Shadows moved around him, swirling like smoke. The air grew colder, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. He turned to me, his face partially obscured by the hoodie, but his grin was unmistakable. Too wide, too unnatural. He raised his hand, and another baseball came flying toward me. I ducked, the ball narrowly missing my head. "What the hell is your problem?" I shouted, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. This wasn't a prank anymore. Something was wrong, very wrong. Fueled by a mix of anger and fear, I chased after him, weaving through the aisles. The store seemed to stretch on forever, the aisles growing longer and darker with each step. The man appeared at the far end of one aisle, staring at me. He raised his arm, and this time a cascade of baseballs tumbled from the top shelves, forcing me to jump out of the way. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw him again, this time wearing a football helmet and shoulder pads. He stood motionless like a mannequin before breaking into a sprint straight toward me. I braced for impact, but he disappeared inches before colliding with me. The lights flickered violently, and when they steadied, the store was empty. No customers, no coworkers, just me. The store had changed. The aisles were twisted, looping in impossible ways. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and the air was thick with whispers, low, indecipherable voices that seemed to call my name. I tried to find an exit, but every path led me deeper into the maze. At the end of one aisle, I saw the man again. He wasn't wearing his helmet anymore. His face was grotesque, stretched and twisted like a wax figure melted in the sun. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice layered with others, like a choir of whispers. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. His grin widened. "You'll see." The lights overhead flickered, and the walls around me began to collapse, revealing an endless void beyond. The man lunged at me, his distorted form twisting unnaturally as he moved. I ran, dodging falling shelves and scattered sports equipment. The whispers grew deafening, and the cold bit at my skin. Finally, I saw it, a faint glow at the end of a corridor. Desperation pushed me forward, and I sprinted toward it. The man's laughter echoed behind me, closer and closer. Just as I reached the light, his hand grabbed my shoulder, freezing me in place. "See you next time," he whispered, his voice sending chills down my spine. I stumbled through the light, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. When I opened my eyes, the store was back to normal. Customers wandered the aisles, and my coworkers were at the checkout counter. But something was different. They didn't seem to notice me. I called out, but no one reacted. I walked to the exit, and as I passed a mirror near the front, I froze. My reflection wasn't there. Outside, the world looked the same, but I knew I wasn't part of it anymore. And somewhere in the distance, I heard his laughter. I used to work at a retail store called Madison's, a pretty big place with all kinds of stuff, clothes, home goods, the works. It was the kind of store that felt endless, especially late at night when things were quiet and you could hear every little noise. I was stationed at the customer service desk, tucked away in the back corner. That night, it was just me and Lauren, the cashier up front, finishing up our shifts. The store was set to close in about 15 minutes and most of the customers had already left. It started as a faint noise, like someone chuckling. At first, I thought maybe it was the music playing overhead, but the sound was too sharp, too real. I glanced up from the returns I was sorting, scanning the aisles in front of me. Nothing. Just racks of clothes and the eerie stillness that creeps in when a store is about to close. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then I heard it again. This time it wasn't laughter. It was slow, deliberate breathing, like someone was standing just out of sight watching me. My stomach did a little flip, but I told myself it was nothing. I mean, how often do you hear weird noises when you're tired? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, the laughter came back, louder this time, like it was coming from somewhere between the racks of winter coats. I stood up, craning my neck to get a better look. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing a little too loudly in the empty store. No response. The place felt off, like the air was heavier than it should have been. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe some kid had left their phone playing a video or something. But as the minutes ticked by, the sounds kept coming. Laughter, breathing, even what sounded like footsteps. I decided to check it out. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and walked toward the noise. Rows of clothing racks stretched out like a maze, shadows dancing as I moved. My heart was racing, but I didn't see anyone. Just as I was about to give up, something caught my eye on a top shelf. A sweater was tossed haphazardly over a Bluetooth speaker. Bingo. Someone must have left it there, playing creepy sounds to freak someone out. I let out a nervous laugh, picking up the speaker. "Nice prank," I muttered, shaking my head. But as I headed back to the desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When I got back to the desk, Lauren was finishing up counting her drawer. I held up the speaker. "You won't believe this. Someone left this back there playing creepy noises," I said, half laughing. She raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? That's so weird." We both laughed it off, but then something crashed in the back of the store, a loud metallic thud that made us both jump. "Did you hear that?" Lauren asked, her voice suddenly tight. "Yeah," I said, my pulse quickening. "Stay here. I'll check it out." I walked back into the store, trying to convince myself it was just something falling off a shelf. But as I moved deeper into the aisles, the uneasy feeling came back. The lights felt dimmer, the shadows longer. It was like the store itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaky. Nothing. Then from the corner of my eye I saw movement, a shadow darting between the racks. My breath caught and I froze. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice louder now. No answer. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I crept toward where I'd seen the shadow, but there was no one there, just silence. I spun around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but the aisle was empty. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind when I heard Lauren scream. I bolted back to the front of the store, my heart pounding. "What happened?" I asked, skidding to a stop. "I saw someone," she said, her face pale. "He was standing in the appliance aisle, just staring." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you see where he went?" She shook her head. "No, he just disappeared." We decided to stick together after that. Grabbing a flashlight from the desk, we started searching the store, calling out to whoever was there. The place was huge, with plenty of spots for someone to hide. Dressing rooms, stock shelves, even the storage area in the back. But no matter where we looked, we couldn't find anyone. "Maybe he left," Lauren suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it either. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from one of the aisles. We both turned at the same time, our flashlights cutting through the dark. At the end of the aisle, a tall man in a dark hoodie stood motionless, his face obscured by shadows. "Hey!" I yelled, but he didn't move. He just stood there watching us. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. Lauren and I ran after him, but by the time we got to the front doors, he was already outside, strolling across the parking lot like nothing had happened. We watched as he disappeared into the night, his silhouette vanishing into the shadows. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The store was dead silent, like it was holding its breath. Finally, Lauren broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" "I have no idea," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think I want to know." Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it just a prank, some weirdo playing games, or was it something else entirely? All I know is, I'll never forget the way he looked at us before he walked out, like he knew something we didn't, and honestly, I hope I never find out. Working late nights at a clothing store in a mall wasn't exactly thrilling, but it had its perks, mostly the peace and quiet. The store was small, tucked in a corner of the mall that didn't see much traffic after dinner hours. That night started like any other, but something about it felt off. The day had been unusually slow. A few customers drifted in and out, but nothing noteworthy. Around mid-afternoon, this guy walked in, tall, lanky, with a hoodie pulled tight around his face. He moved strangely, like he didn't know what he was looking for. His eyes darted around, not at the clothes, but at the store itself. I asked if he needed help, but he just grunted and wandered off, leaving without buying anything. Weird, but not unheard of. As the evening dragged on, the mall grew eerily quiet. I always loved that part. No crowds, no noise, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of my own footsteps. By closing time, I was alone, as usual. I went through my routine, locking the glass doors, flipping the closed sign, and starting to clean up. Then it happened. A faint tapping sound came from the front of the store. I froze, my eyes darting toward the glass doors. Standing there was the same guy from earlier, his hood now pulled back. He wasn't tapping anymore. He was staring straight at me, his face pale and expressionless. I walked to the door, trying to appear calm. "We're closed," I said firmly. He didn't respond, just kept staring. His eyes were hollow, unblinking, like he was trying to bore a hole through me. After a long pause, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the empty mall. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something about the way he looked at me left a knot in my stomach, like he wasn't done yet. As I wiped down the counter, I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe he was just a harmless weirdo. But then a loud bang shattered the silence, and I nearly dropped the cleaning spray. I turned toward the door and saw him. He was back. This time he had something in his hand, a crowbar. My heart sank. He swung it hard against the glass, the impact echoing through the store. Cracks splintered across the surface like a spiderweb. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, my voice trembling. He didn't even flinch. Another swing, and the cracks deepened. Panic surged through me. I knew the glass wouldn't hold much longer. I backed away, my mind racing. There was only one exit, and he was blocking it. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash, shards scattering everywhere. He stepped through the broken doorway, his face illuminated by the dim store lights. His eyes were wild now, his lips twisted into a manic grin. I bolted toward the back of the store, my legs moving on autopilot. I slammed the storage room door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The thin wooden door felt like it could snap in half if he tried hard enough. Fumbling with my phone, I dialed 911. My voice came out in a whisper as I explained what was happening. The operator told me to stay hidden and quiet and that officers were on their way. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He was inside the store now, moving closer. He stopped right outside the storage room, and for a moment all I could hear was his breathing. Heavy, erratic. Then he spoke. "I know you're in there. I know you're in there," he said again, this time louder, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. My hands were trembling so much I almost dropped the phone. I pressed myself against the far wall of the storage room, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay hidden. The doorknob rattled and my breath caught in my throat. Then came the banging. It wasn't random. It was methodical, like he was testing how much force the door could take. "You can't hide forever," he muttered, almost playfully, as if he were enjoying this. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. The door shook violently with each hit, but somehow it held. The banging stopped abruptly, and I strained to hear what he was doing. Footsteps. He was walking away, heading back into the main store. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd given up. Then I heard it. A crash, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. My mind raced. Was he trying to find another way in? My stomach churned as I thought about what he could be planning. Minutes passed like hours. I couldn't hear him anymore, but the silence was almost worse. My imagination filled the gaps, conjuring images of him waiting just outside, ready to strike. Then, faintly, I heard it. Sirens. The sound grew louder, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of relief. "Police!" a voice boomed from outside the store. The sound of authority broke through the oppressive fear like a beacon of hope. I stayed put, waiting for some sign it was safe to come out. A few moments later, I heard the officers inside, calling out as they searched the store. I unlocked the storage room door and stepped out, my legs shaky. The store was a disaster, broken glass, clothes scattered everywhere. But the man was gone. The officers asked me to describe him again, and I did my best. Pale skin, sunken eyes, that eerie grin. They nodded, their expressions grim. "We'll look around," one of them said before leaving to search the mall. Another officer stayed with me, trying to calm me down. "You're safe now," she said. But was I? My mind kept replaying everything from the moment he first walked in to the sound of him breaking in. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. About 15 minutes later, one of the officers returned. "We found him," he said, his voice tight. "Or what's left of him." My heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? What's left? They didn't give me all the details, but they found him in the parking garage. He wasn't alive anymore. They hinted it was self-inflicted, but something about the way they avoided specifics left me uneasy. Why had he targeted me? Why my store? And why did it feel like there was more to this story than they were letting on? I left the mall that night and never went back. I quit the job the next morning. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that store again. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about it. Not just the terror of that night, but the look in his eyes. It wasn't just anger or desperation. It was something darker, something I still can't explain. People ask me why I don't work late shifts anymore, and I tell them it's because I like mornings better. But the truth? The truth is, sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see him standing there, smiling through the glass like he was waiting for me to look away.